Today's message is taken by our very own Mark Pomery. It's week 4 of Naked and Unafraid.
Hey, to those of you that have been part of our online hub for a while, it's been great to have the opportunity and the honor to be journeying with you. And the journey continues today, which is fantastic. And a special shout out to those of you who are joining us for the first time. I need to warn you, for those of you joining for the first time, that we have extensions, house extensions happening just here. And things could get noisy. In fact, today's background power tools are actually brought to you by a carpenter who's currently working on the roof right above us. So let's see how this goes. But this is week 4 of the series we've called Naked and Unafraid. And this series is all about taking the risks and embracing the rewards of living a large, open, and expansive life. And the taking of the risks isn't the point. However, the taking of the risks leads us to the pathway of experiencing the rewards. And the theme for this series is actually taken from something that Paul, one of the heavyweights of the early church, wrote to the church in Corinth. And I'm going to drop us right in there. And so you get a clear picture of what Paul encouraged us and what Paul outline is available for us. He wrote this to the Corinthian church, and it's very true for us today in 2020. He wrote, Dear Corinthians, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter this wide, open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. Now, your lives aren't small, but you're living them in a small way. And I'm speaking as plainly as I can and with great affection. So open up your lives, live open and expansively. As I mentioned, we're currently having some extensions done just to the back of our current house. And so while that's happening, we're living on the premises and we're living in the existing house. We've just kind of pushed all of our worldly possessions into a couple of rooms of the existing house. So we've got stuff in every single corner. I mean, literally we're living not only in a construction site, but actually a living, breathing trip hazard. And our builder, however, this is breaking news, people, has actually promised us that we will be able to move into the new extension in 4 weeks' time. So here's the thing. Picture this. Let's suppose in 4 weeks' time, our builder says, here's the keys to the new extension. Go for it. It's wide, it's open, it's spacious, and you can move in there today. Imagine if, despite him promising that, despite him showing us that, imagine if we said to him and to each other, no, we're just going to keep living in this confined 2-room space. I mean, it would literally make no sense, but this is the big idea that Paul's putting out there, that God has promised us wide open spaces. He's shown us wide open spaces. He's calling us to move into wide open spaces, and they're available now. So why would any of us choose to live small, choose to live in a confined way? Instead, he calls us to live naked and unafraid, that opportunities are on the other side of this fence that we might be currently living in. And to seize those opportunities requires us to step over the fence and then to move forward into the wide, open, spacious life that God calls us to. Now, week 1, our friend Steve Hall kicked this off talking about risk exposure, that the idea that playing it safe is dangerous. Week 2, I talked about the need to abandon smallness, that there's 2 versions of us. There's the mini us and there's the big us. And the big us is the one that God's created us to become, brimming with potential and purpose and called to access opportunity and to continue to grow. And then last week, Steve again talked about the need to push past criticism, that as we do something new, as we take steps of faith, as we make ourselves vulnerable and move into territories, even when there's no guarantee of the outcome, sometimes we're going to get criticized. It might be us telling us we can't do it, and or it might be someone else telling us we can't do it. And the important thing is that we listen more intently to the voice of God and we keep moving in that direction and not fenced in by the critics. And today I want to talk about the importance to own your story. Now, by many accounts, I shouldn't be here today. And now, I don't mean like on the planet. I mean, I shouldn't be leading a church today and having the opportunity and the privilege of speaking with you today. And that's because a little over a decade ago, I was actually fired from a church that I was leading. I didn't do anything, like no financial mismanagement or nothing like that. But the board at the time of that church, they decided that I wasn't a good fit for them. And so they gave me my marching orders. And I let some of my friends and colleagues around the world know what had happened. I'm now have moved on from that church, and I'm praying about the next opportunity for me. And would love you to pray for us at this time. Pray for wisdom and favor and opportunity. And one of my former colleagues replied to the email that I sent out, and he asked the question, what are you going to do next? And I replied to him, well, I'm going to lead another church. And he replied to that with the words, that's great. Because there's too many good people leaving the battlefield. Now, the thing was, for me, I felt God calling me to one day lead a church when I was in my early 20s. And here I was at that time, just turned 40 years old, and I'm now been fired from a church. And I had to make a decision. I had to make a decision who was going to be responsible for the next chapter of my life. Who was going to be responsible for the continued direction of my life? Was I going to give that responsibility over to this board who'd fired me and sit around saying it's not fair, I didn't deserve this, they were wrong, this is an injustice, and I'm never going to put myself in that position again. I'm never going to lead a church again. I'm done with churches. You can't trust boards. I'm not going to be vulnerable in that way again. And had I done that because I was hurting, it was painful for myself and for Louisa, my wife. Had I done that, had I thrown my toys out of the cot and said I'm not going to do this again, I think some people might have considered that to be a reasonable response. Why would anyone want to put themselves in that same position again, or at least the potential to be in that position again? But I can tell you I didn't do that. And I'm not trying to flex. This is the facts of my story. I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be leading a church. I wouldn't be with you on our online experience today if I'd chosen to give other people ownership of my story. See, it required me saying, the facts are I got fired. The facts are I don't think I deserved it. The facts are I'm, currently without a job. And the facts are I came from a corporate background. I could just go back to that. But that would be giving the circumstances and the people that cause those circumstances ownership of my story. Instead, what I chose to do was I chose to own my story. My story. And whilst I wasn't denying what had happened, now the next step became about taking responsibility for what lay ahead, about not abandoning or doubting the call of God that He'd put in my life when I was in my early 20s to lead a church. And yes, I temporarily was on the bench, but I wasn't going to leave the field. And so for you, are you owning your story? See, just because you didn't have control over what happened to you in your past doesn't mean, and don't make the mistake of thinking that that means you don't have control over what can happen in your future. You know, despite the cards you've been dealt, despite the pain you've experienced, despite the damage inflicted on you by other people, don't get fenced in by handing over your story to other people, handing over your story to negative circumstances, handing over your story to ongoing pain. Instead, take responsibility and continue to move into the open and expansive life that God's calling you to. This same guy, Paul, wrote quite a lot of letters to various churches at the time. And one of them is a church in a place called Galatia. And so if you've got your Bible app, pop open your second device or switch screens there, leave me in the corner, of course. Open the Bible app and join me in a letter he wrote to the church in Galatia. And I'm going to just read a slice of Paul's letter to that church in chapter 6. So I'm going to read from the Message version. Here's what Paul encouraged them with. He said, "Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life." Let me read that one more time. I love this. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best you can with your own life. So imagine this. You're driving along down the highway and your car breaks down and you have to sort of coast and pull over to the side of the road. You've got two options. You could just sit there in your broken down car and complain. Why did this happen to me? I don't know what caused this. This isn't fair. What an inconvenience. Why did this happen to me? And while you're sitting there, eventually the police are going to pull up next to you while you're in the way on the side of the road. And they're going to knock on your window and they're going to ask you to move your car off the highway. And what they don't want you to say is, well, why should I move it? Because they will simply tell you, you need to move it because you own it. It's your car. And you can say, well, I didn't cause the breakdown. Yeah, fine. You need to move it. Well, it's just not fair. Fine. You need to move it. You need to take responsibility to take your broken down car and get it off the side of the road. But here's the great news. You don't need to know what caused it. You don't need to fix it yourself. You can actually call for outside assistance, a roadside assistance service, a tow truck. There are external people and external services that can help you move your car, your broken down car, move it forward. But you still have to be responsible and take responsibility for activating that. And it's the same for life. It's the same for your life. It's the same for my life. There's stuff that's happened to us and there's stuff that does happen to us. And there's going to be stuff that will happen to us. That it would be a fact if we said, that's not fair. It would be a fact if we said, why did this happen to me? Those are facts. And so I'm not talking about denial. But if you choose to not take responsibility, you will get stuck there. It will leave you there. You'll start living fenced in by those circumstances. Instead, you've got to own your story and take responsibility for moving forward. And just like with the broken down car, you don't have to do it and fix it all by yourself. You can call for outside assistance. God, there's a great starting point. Call on Him for help. Professionals, counselors, etc., call on them for help. And of course, having great, encouraging friends around you are all part of you moving forward. Nevertheless, at the center of all of that is the need for you to take responsibility and to own your story. So I want to give you a very simple yet profound principle to live by when it comes to how we own our story, how we respond when things haven't gone well for us. And the principle is simply this: no victim, no blame, no excuses. So I want to just drill into those three things really, really quickly. Let's start with the first one, no victim. See, one of the things that some people have learned when something negative's happened to them is if they play the victim card, they learn that that will actually get them more attention and more sympathy, at least initially. And so they get very good at playing the victim. But owning your story means you don't allow yourself to play the victim, because you need to understand that if you play the victim, you stay the victim. And you can't play the victim and be a victor at the same time. Some of the defense when you are a victim is the narrative in your head. You know, you're telling yourself you're a victim. You're telling yourself it's unfair. You're telling yourself it's unjust. And that's the narrative that plays over and over and over again. The problem with that being the single narrative is that starts to create offense. You actually start to live inside a fence that you created for yourself. Again, it's not about denying the circumstances. It's not about saying these things didn't happen to you. It is, however, about saying, okay, now what? Yes, this happened to me. Now what? Yes, this happened to me, but I'm not going to stay the victim. In fact, I'm going to live victorious, and I'm going to move from victim to victor. I'm not going to allow these circumstances to define who I am, and I'm certainly not going to allow these circumstances to define the next chapter of my life. And again, I repeat, you don't have to move from victim to victor all by yourself. Call on the assistance of God, of people, of professionals, absolutely. Yet at the core of it is you owning your story. The second one, no blame. This one starts early. And those of you who are parents, you know this. You know this when Junior and maybe a fellow young sibling or maybe a playmate were in your house, and things got awfully quiet, and you have learned that when things get quiet, it probably means somebody's up to mischief. And so you go looking for these little creatures inside your house, and you walk in there and you see something catastrophic, whatever it is. And you ask the obvious question, who did this? And Junior looks at the other one looks at Junior, and they both look at you, and they both say in unison, wasn't me. I wonder if some of you have even walked into a room that Junior's there all by themselves, and something catastrophic's happened. And you say, who did this? And Junior looks and says, well, it wasn't me. You know, this finger pointing or this blame shifting or this deflection, you know, it starts early. And it starts with the simple motivation of trying to avoid getting into trouble. And it's not a new phenomenon. In fact, when we read the creation account, you know, we read about Adam and Eve, and we read about how they're living in this paradise in unbroken, unfiltered relationship with God. And God had just given them one simple warning that there was one tree, that they could eat anything in the garden except for the fruit of one tree. And God came to check on them, and he discovered that they had eaten of the fruit of that one tree, despite him telling them not to. And so he asked Adam, you know, what happened? And he goes, well, it wasn't me. It was the woman you gave me. So he's kind of handing the blame around. He's giving it a bit to Eve, and he's giving it a bit to God. You know, the woman who you gave me, well, that's the problem here. And then God says to Eve, well, come on, you know, can you explain yourself? And she says, well, no, the devil made me do it. It's like, well, the devil suggested you do it, but he didn't make you. I mean, he can't make you do it. And again, it's this blame shifting and this finger pointing that's kind of baked into us, or baked into our broken selves. However, if we carry that deflection, finger pointing, blame shifting, avoidance approach and mentality into our adult years, that's not owning your story. That's playing the blame. So we're talking about no victim, no blame. See, this house that we're currently living in and having the work done, we moved in just under 3 years ago. And to get things going, we have part of our vision is to create a bit of an urban farm with lots of, vegetables and fruits and herbs and so on. So project one was to get started by putting in some fruit trees and some nut trees. And, they take a little while to mature. So I wanted to get them started straight away. So macadamia and almond and lemon and nectarine and apples and so wonderful. Put them in, got them going. And unfortunately, after about 1 year, several of those trees had gone to be with Jesus. They were dead. And let me tell you why. The main reason those trees died was because this house, the previous owners, they'd actually rented the house out. So the owners didn't live here. They had it as an investment property. And they had rented the house out. And look, I'm not going to say all renters fall into this category, but let's just say the people that were renting this house, they didn't really think looking after the garden was a big priority. And so we had a broken irrigation system. We inherited very poor Perth soil. Trust me, it's terrible soil. And so these trees, even though I'd put some compost on and I'd been fertilizing them some and watering them some, they just did not get through year one because of the poor condition in the garden that the previous occupants had left us with. Now, the fact is that the previous occupants had handed over to us poor garden conditions. That's the fact. But I've got a bunch of dead trees that aren't going to produce any fruit if all I do is sit around blaming the previous occupants, blaming them for the poor irrigation, blaming them for the lack of nutrient-rich soil. Instead, I had to own my story. And you know why I had to own my story? Because this was now our house. We own it. Buddy, you own it. You want better soil, you get better soil. You want a better reticulation system, you fix the reticulation system. It's not anybody else's responsibility. You own the house, you own the story. No victim, no blame. Let me just add a little kind of bonus point here. Blaming others is a problem. But there's another problem that maybe is a little less obvious, and that's blaming yourself. See, some of you, the fence you're living behind isn't that you're blaming others, it's that you're blaming yourself because potentially for you, you've done something dumb, unwise, less than God's best, and you have nobody to blame but yourself. Now, whilst that could be the fact, nobody to blame but yourself. If you only sit around pointing the finger at yourself, why was I so stupid? Why was I so dumb? How could I have ever thought that was a good idea? If that's the narrative about you blaming yourself, again, you're not going to move forward. That very pattern of repeatedly blaming yourself is going to fence you in. See, focus your attention on what's next. Now, bank the lesson. I mean, evaluate your experience. Why did I do that? Why was I so stupid? Why did I make that decision? Why did I say that? Why did I do... Evaluate the lesson, bank the lesson so that you'll be less likely to repeat the dumb, unwise thing. And now, focus on moving forward with your evaluated experience tucked in to your pocket. Do the creative best with your own life. And then finally, real quickly, no excuses. The thing about making excuses is they can make us feel better, but they don't make us better. They can make us feel better because, I mean, of course that's what happened. I mean, come on now, what did you expect? I mean, it's obvious that that's what happened in that context. Yeah, okay, so it makes you feel better. It makes you less to blame. It makes you feel less guilty, less culpable, but it doesn't make you better. One of the key principles that I learned at some point in my life on this planet is that there is a difference between giving an explanation and an excuse. See, an explanation, if you've done something or something's happened and there's an explanation. This is why that happened. This is who caused that. This was the backstory. This was the context. These were the circumstances surrounding that. That explanation can be helpful. It can be helpful for you to better understand how and why things happen. It can be helpful for the people around you, your spouse, your kids, your employer, etc., for them to better understand how this happened. But sitting around just making excuses doesn't make us better. So I want to invite you to join us again next week. We got a special bonus in our Elevate online experience where we're going to show you the story. In fact, next week and the week after, we're going to show you two incredibly inspiring stories of people whose lives, who had every reason to play the victim, to play the blame, and to make the excuses, but didn't, and have in their lives moved beyond the fence of victim, blame, excuses, and are moving into wide open spaces. So join us again next week and the week after. Invite someone to come along. You can have a watch party on your couch in your living room and be inspired by their story. All the while learning to better own your story and to live naked and unafraid, move over the fence into the wide, open, spacious life that God's promised. See you then.